Greetings, friends! Juan and Grizka here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian war update for the weeks of June 8th through 21st of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts. Hope you're having an awesome day. We are starting in the Kostyantynivka direction, because this week, the battle for Kostyantynivka is basically coming to a close. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things to be said about, when does it officially end? Does it end when when the Ukrainians get expelled from every single building? If that's the case, we might actually see it go a bit longer. Let me explain. So, what happened in the last 2 weeks during this part of June is that the Russians have basically liquidated the main central part of Kostyantynivka. We talked about last week how the Russians seemed like they broke through and started liquidating this kind of eastern or western portion of Kostyantynivka. But after a couple of days, we realized that the Russians basically took this entire area. Not only that, we had Russian soldiers being in this northern micro district of Kostyantynivka. And so not only that, then I'm like, okay, well then the next thing is the Ukrainians had a big defense in the eastern part of Kostyantynivka. And then in the last week, the Russians have been able to liquidate that. We had Russians raising their flags all over what they call the historic district of Kostyantynivka. Mainly this area right here of with these high-rise buildings right here. So we have the Russians raising their flags here. We have the Russians being in this in the fucking factories town area. And so right now the thing is that it's not 100% secure. Now the Russians are all over here, and right now they are clearing the basements. They are still there's been sources saying there's been a couple, maybe like 100 Ukrainians or so, that are hiding in some of these basements. That so the Russians managed to cut off the supply, basically the retreat of the Ukrainians here. And so the Ukrainians that are like hiding up in the basements in some of these areas, they have no way to escape, and so the Russians have to clear them out, force them to retreat, and so forth. So it's basically a giant. Right now, right now, like if you look, the Russians are basically in control of everything behind this red line, but that means there's still the northern part of Kostyantynivka, this area right here, these two micro districts, and now that's what I mean when I say, can the Battle of Kostyantynivka last for a bit of a longer time? And I'll explain that in a second here. But basically, right now, what the Russians are doing, what they did was they basically used Dnipropetrovsk. They moved through kind of these areas right here, is what my guess is. And then, once they established themselves in this area, they then attacked this way, along with the recently captured eastern part of Kostyantynivka, managed to cross the river and capture this area right here. It does show about how weak the Ukrainian infantry is. They're putting everything they have into drones. But in terms of, because once the Russians actually infiltrated the city, managed to accumulate and started, it actually was very, easy to clear this. It took very fast in terms of how long it would take to usually clear cities for the Russians to take it. What took long was the Russians trying to approach the city, because the Ukrainians had everything shown with drones and everything. So very good news for the Russians in terms. It kind of shows how weak the Ukrainian infantry is. But in terms of when they want to go through the open fields, the Ukrainians will have a field day. And so that's actually, I'm actually going to talk about this for a little bit here once I finish talking about what happened in Kostyantynivka, because that's kind of the main show. It's what's happening in the war at the moment in terms of the ground. So the right now, and I'm by the end of June, I would suppose, by the time I come back to you guys, basically I'm assuming the Russians will basically finish clearing out all these basements and securing themselves here. They're gonna accumulate infantry, bring up their drone operators, bring up supply hubs, turn Kostyantynivka into a hub of logistics and a forward operating base where they could accumulate a ton of soldiers, and then from here they're going to continue pushing towards Alexander Druskovka. Now, what I meant about earlier, that where they could, so basically the Russians have the battle for Kostyantynivka is basically over. The main defenses and the biggest part of the city has been captured. The high-rise buildings, the industrial zones, just the kind of the more residential northern districts are still under Ukrainian control. Now, the reason why this might last for a little bit longer is because as the Russians try to, enter here, I have no doubts that Sursky, to deny that Kostyantynivka has been taken, will send suicide units, assault units to try to continue sending troops into these areas. And so, we might not see these northern areas cleared for a little bit. Maybe it might, so it just depends on how long, if the Russians will continue, if the Russians are going to just take Kostyantynivka and stop, just like as we saw, for example, once they took Pokrovsk and Minigrad, a lot of people are like, oh, they're now going to push towards Dobropillya. but it seems like they actually just completely stopped. Once they took Kostyantynivka, they just stopped. And so, once they take Kostyantynivka, are they going to focus somewhere else? Is there going to be a pause and they're going to redeploy forces? Because a lot of people, what I think, now this is just my opinion, so it could be anything. I don't have like the Russian plans, for example, but my estimation is the Russians are actually continue pushing towards Alexandria-Juskovka, because not only is it really really close, it's not like it's gonna be unlike Dobropillya, which is separated by a bunch of villages from Pokrovsk, so it's actually a lot harder to reach there. Alexandria-Juskovka is actually very very close to Kostyantynivka, so to actually infiltrate it and to attack it, actually it'll be pretty easy. The other thing the Russians are actually probably going to do as well is to clear out this pocket to the north here. The Ukrainians have been using this pocket, which has been a pain in the ass for the Russians to try to infiltrate the eastern part of Kostyantynivka. But, Mykolaievka and Stinky and Chevron and so forth, this area is, you might think that there's nothing here, but there's actually a huge built-up trench network here that the Ukrainians have built up because, this has been the front line for years. And so the Russians can actually use this not only with the kind of the greenery here a little bit, but also the all the trenches and man-made structures that are here. And so my guess is what the Russians will do is have a line from Markova down to Stinky and down to Kostyantynivka and have the line here. And then so they'll clear out this northern pocket is what I'm going to be guessing for the next push as well. Now continue pushing up north to these micro districts and these residential areas, and then also clear out this area right here. And so that will be what the Russians will be doing in the next 2-3 weeks or so. And then for the rest of the summer, I do think they're actually going to start pushing toward Alexandria-Juskovka. As you can see, and along with this, I do think the Russians will also try to push, along this rail line, try to take Rubovka, Klinovo, Popasna, try to, and put themselves around this area right here. And then, from here, then the only thing that will supply Kostyantynivka is this highway here. There's only one road, and so the Russians will put this highway under strict fire control. They're going to mine it. It's going to be very, very hard for the Ukrainians to supply the garrison here. And as you can see, there's no roads from in this area. There's no way for the Ukrainians to try to move through these fields. It's just going to be extremely hard for them to do so. And so I actually do think the Russians will push towards Alexandria-Juskovka. Now here's what I mean by what the Russians will do after they take Alexandria-Juskovka, which I think it's definitely a possibility for them to take it if they do push in that direction, unless they want to redeploy their forces elsewhere after they take Kostyantynivka fully. Now, the reason I say is because of the drone wars. Actually, you really want to actually fight in urban battles. The only reason you don't no longer actually even want to surround it. You could actually use drones. With the amount of drones that are being used, drones are basically the way you want to cut off supply to places. So you don't even have to physically encircle it. And also, you kind of want to have an exit route for the for the people who are in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and Druskovka, which is the main Ukrainian defense line in Donbass. You want them to leave. You want them to have a sense of like, oh, we're being put under pressure. Let's leave. But besides that, what you actually want to do is actually do direct urban assaults. I actually saw in Kostyantynivka, once the Russians actually started battling inside Kostyantynivka, and were able to start infiltrating it, then it was basically game set match. And the reason you want that is because, and it kind of goes against what you think about warfare, is because people think, do you want to avoid urban battles? You actually want, because that's actually how you save yourself from drones. The Russians are having because of how bad the state of the Ukrainian infantry is, and everything. It's actually very very easy for the as we saw that there's probably barely any Ukrainians. It was basically defended mostly by drones, which were basically killing, trying to attack the Russians while they were out in these fields here, and as they were trying to approach Kostyantynivka, and then exposing themselves out in the tree lines and forests and out in the open fields. And so they were using Kostyantynivka to drone the Russians. But once the Russians entered it, and then there was nothing, because then it's very very hard to kill people who are in built up buildings, because you have protection. So that's actually why I think the Russians actually will want to do just kind of maybe actually do before I thought they would try to encircle the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Druskovka line. I think they're going to just continue pushing. And the only reason I don't think they're going to continue pushing towards Druskovka is because I think they need to do a bit more advancements near Dobropillya, try to take a bunch of this area, cut this highway, and that way they could then put any supplies that are coming from the north here towards Druskovka under fire control. The Russians who are going to be pushing towards Alexandria-Juskovka in this area will then put this highway under drone control, and then from there, the Russians will then just try to infiltrate Juskovka, and probably also from here as well. The reason for this is because you actually, again, same reason, you want to actually have urban battles to be consolidating. So yeah, so I do actually think they're going to basically do like a attack directly on the Slavyansk line and the Juskovka line, and I don't think they're going to do some sort of major big battle to try to and the only, they might push towards Dobropillya and, this area just so they could then, put their forces a little bit more further. And that way, they could then put this main highway, which is the main road of life for this entire area, the Alexandrivka Kramatorsk highway here. This is the main lifeline. Because all the other highways and roads that are to the north can be put under drone control even now. Once the Russians take Lyman, this highway, and then this road from Barnakovo towards Slavyansk will be under drone control. The drones from the highways from like Dobropillya towards Druskov and Kramatorsk are already under fire control, and so it's like this highway right here, which is kind of, I mean, the Russians could strike it; they have the drones to do so, but they don't. It's more of their more advanced drones. They can't take their regular drones, which they have in the a ton of, to strike it. So they need to push a little bit further. So I do think they're going to push towards Dobropillya, but I think they're kind of, for their summer campaign, they're focusing on taking this area right here at the moment. And so I do think Dobropillya is probably for something later. But I don't think they're going to like continue pushing here. I don't think they're going to want to push through these fields here. I do think what they want to do is push in just actually directly on the Slavyansk Kramatorsk Juskovka line, the SKD the SKD line. So, yeah, we shall see how that develops. But, yeah, the Battle of Kostyantynivka is coming to an end. Another thing that's very interesting is that the Russians have completely taken the town of Dobropillya and Rozhozhensky here. We had the Russians raising their flag here and raising the flags all over Dobropillya. This mapper says that the battle is still ongoing. I actually don't believe that. Once Kostyantynivka fell, there is no reason for the Ukrainians to keep sending troops here. Maybe, same thing as in Kostyantynivka, maybe they're clearing basements. But again, Dobropillya is smaller than Kostyantynivka, so it shouldn't take that long for if they have to clear it. But yeah, they basically have taken control of this area right here. There's probably a small Ukrainian garrison in Mykolaiv, because it's in the middle of nowhere. It's probably hard as fuck to supply, besides probably with drones though. But again, that's still being developed. It's not, it's not as drones could supply you a little bit, but it's not as much as like having cars and trucks and everything delivering things directly to you. But yeah, Dobropillya and Rozhozhensky have also been taken. And also we had Russians in Charkova here. We had Russians raising the flags here. So I actually, so again, this is probably in the gray zone. I do think that right now Russian DRGs are probably actively infiltrating these areas, and I do think that by the, the Russians will continue pushing in this area along with this area, as I mentioned before. So, yeah, the Battle of Kostyantynivka, big news for the Russians. And speaking of which, we're now going to go to the Slavyansk direction. And in the Slavyansk direction, there's actually been a very big news for the Russians here as they continue pushing. The Russians have completely captured the town of Alexandrivka. We had the Russians raising their flags. Before, we had the Russians right on the outskirts here, but we had the Russians raising their flags all over Alexandrivka here. Now, some sources are saying, kind of these like warehouses and this kind of this trench system right here, kind of the most western part of Alexandrivka has not been completely taken yet, because when the Russians raised their flags, it was just in the central part. Along with this, a lot of more pro-Ukrainian sources are saying that it's still the Ukrainians are still holding up in kind of these tree lines right here. And that's why this map, the Syriac, has this under a gray zone, because it's like they have not been completely cleared yet. But I do think that right now the only way they're going to be supplied is through drones, and so right now it's a big question of how long the Ukrainians can hold out here, and when the Russians will storm it. So very. But also in the southern part here, we had some sources are saying that, kind of in these like tree lines, it seems like what the Russians are doing, kind of following what I was saying, is that the Russians are just following the built-up areas. You can see the Russians are, moving through Zakhitna and Kharkov, because, these areas are actual built-up villages, so they want to actually push it. Just, for example, another thing is the Russians continue pushing and actually occupy these dachas to the west of Kharkov, this area right here. They took these dachas here, and so they took them because they could then put soldiers here. But then it might be one, and then I think we had a geolocation of the Ukrainians being between Kharkov and Kalinivka, and it seems like the Russians are kind of bypassing these kind of areas where in these forests, and then just kind of attacking the villages directly. That's why kind of what I would actually do. But again, once you take these areas and you basically, there's no way to supply them anymore. You just bomb them with drones, bomb them completely with fabs and whatnot, and then you try to storm them. The thing is with storming them, you have to kind of expose yourself out in the field. But the thing is, since it's the summer campaign, you would think you would try to just move yourself through the forest and all that, right? And then attack the position. Anyway, the same thing with here. But I do think, these areas will be liquidated very soon. The Russians will continue pushing now with their main position. Focus will be towards the town of Nikolaevka right here. Now, this is going to be a very strong battle. This is going to take a long time. I don't think this battle is going to end until the end of this year, I think. It's going to be a big, bloody battle. The Ukrainians really, really don't want the Russians to take this, because it will be very bad news. But the Russians are making very good progress. They also took the town of Yurivka, and along with this, we had the Russians, we had geolocation of the Russians being in Kostyantynivka here. And so a lot of sources are basically saying the Russians are, completely securing themselves along the canal here, and they have DRGs operating on the other side of the canal to disrupt Ukrainian, positions as well. So Alexandrivka is going to be another town along with Nikiforivka, which is a bigger town than the villages around it, where the Russians can accumulate forces for their push towards Nikolaevka. Now, the only way the battle for Nikolaevka will actually be successful is when Lyman falls, which we'll talk about in a second here once I finish in the Slavyansk direction. Along with this, we had another geolocation of the Russians being in this tree line right in front of Markova and Maisky, so it does show that Markova is probably under good, solid Russian control. But the thing is, these villages have probably been razed to the ground. A lot of these small villages that you look at, like Markova, I'm pretty certain each of these villages buildings have been destroyed. So probably the same with a lot of these areas. So it's hard to know because you're not these maps aren't updated for like a year or two. So it's kind of you don't actually know what's going on the ground, like how destroyed is a village, and such. But anyway, and I actually do think that in terms of and what the Russians will do, they'll continue clearing out these areas. They're going to try to clear out this forest here, and everything. And then what they're going to do is continue pushing along the Seversky Donetsk River, try to capture these two villages, Starodrubivka and this other village here, and then they're going to try to infiltrate the actual Slavyansk power plant here. And then the Russians will also try to use the Alexandrivka in this built-up area to then try to assault Nikolaevka directly, try to accumulate forces here. The Russians will have been bombing this area very heavily, bombing the approaches to Nikolaevka. So they're going to try to squeeze out the Ukrainian garrison here, and I don't think they're going to because this is a very built-up area, And the thing is that Ukrainians have a ton of drone operators in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and so the Russians trying to continue pushing. Not only is there a bunch of built-up areas, is that the Ukrainians are able to they're going to expose themselves out to to drones. So I don't think there's going to be a direct attack, but what I do think is actually they're going to try to take Nikolaevka and then use it as a base to actually infiltrate down the river here and actually take this district of Slavyansk that's on the other side of the river, the Chernobylovka district. And then, from here, they could then just continue pushing towards, just continue putting the squeeze on the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Truskovka line here. And so the main reason for this push towards Nikolaevka, Alexandrivka, towards the canal, is that then the Russians could then put their drone operators in these areas, and then, this is close enough where they're able to start striking. Now, they're not going to be able to start striking the strong logistics of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk back with like regular drones. Obviously, maybe with fiber optic and long range drones they can. But, what they can do is strike, use drones to, use reconnaissance in these cities, and then they could then use them to blow up every single, where they could pinpoint where the Ukrainian drone operators are, so they could fab them. They could point out where the Ukrainian infantry is. They could bomb any trucks, vehicles, anything that are here. So, very, very bad. So they could then use the canal in Nikolaevka. Use this line to just keep making these into dead cities. Make this and everything. So, and then the attacks from the flanks here, which I talked about earlier, will be to destroy the logistics in the more western part of Donbass. So yeah, that's the Slavyansk direction. Very good news for the fall of Alexandrivka. And now let's talk about Lyman. This kind of also talks about, this is the other kind of another big focus point in terms of what's happening on the ground. A lot of sources are now saying the battle for Lyman is coming to an end. Before we talked about how maybe there were some infiltrations. We had some Russian troops infiltrating a little bit, but in the last 2 weeks during this time of June, we've had tons of geolocations of the Russians racing all over Lyman. You could actually basically see almost the entire part of Lyman is in a gray zone, or at the very least, there is, that's so. Like Syriac, for example, shows us a giant gray zone. Now, where the Ukrainians are trying to hold up is there's one area is the northern part right here, this kind of northern district here. The other area is this high-rise building area in the southern part of Lyman, this area right here, and which is kind of actually linked to the second part, which is this railway station, which is actually one of the biggest railway stations in all of Donbass. Lyman used to be a very giant logistics node, and the railway station shows it. So the Ukrainians are still held up here, obviously also in the built-up high-rise buildings. The same thing in Kostyantynivka, where most of the Russians are holding up in the, or the Ukrainians are holding themselves up in the that's where they're hiding. That's where the Russians have to clear out. But we've had we had geolocations of the Russians actually being in these high-rise building areas. We had the Russians being, in this area, in this area. I'm trying to remember all the but there's multiple. There wasn't just one or two. There was 7 different geolocations of the Russians being all over the Lyman. And now, according to pro-Russian sources, they're consolidating, in this area. They're consolidating in the southern part, and they're just slowly pushing towards, this northern part, slowly pushing towards the, the rail line and everything. So the battle for Lyman, I'm not saying is basically over like it is in Kostyantynivka, but the battle is in full swing, and it's very much the defenses of Lyman are collapsing. Now, the reason why I'm not saying it's over is because not only is there still defense nodes where the Ukrainians could hold out, and actually, try to push the Russians back, unlike in Kostyantynivka where it's just some residential areas. It's also that the flanks are being attacked by the Ukrainians. So we'll talk about that right now. So the biggest that there was a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the northern part where we had 1 or 2 geolocations of the Ukrainians being bombed in this tree line right here. And so, it does show that they bypassed. Sources are saying they bypassed Kharkov, for example, and they also are trying to attack from the north here, but they got I think it was a week or 2 ago where we had right in the Kharkov-Donetsk border where a vehicle got destroyed. So now it's a big question now. A lot of sources, Ukrainians are saying, "Oh, we had a huge, attack here. We're destroying the again, the main purpose here is to take the town of Nova, which is the main, and then once they take Nova, they could then continue trying to push south towards the town of Dnipropetrovsk, which is, and if the Ukrainians could take these 2 towns, that'll be huge, big loss for the Russians, because then this entire northern salient will be very much weakened, and the Ukrainians could then supply Lyman from the north, and that way, if the Ukrainians are successful, then they can then put try to kick the Russians who are trying to infiltrate and establish themselves in Lyman out. But that was like 2 weeks ago almost, and a lot of Ukrainians are saying, "Oh, it's a secret operation. There's OPSEC." Oh, yeah, but the thing is that if there was more success, we would see it, and we would see the Russians bombing. And so, I think, there was a Ukrainian counterattack here, and so that probably does divert Russian resources, but we still don't know the exact, have the Ukrainians retaken Rekedup, because when the Ukrainians were being bombed in this tree line, was that just an infiltration group, and then they got eliminated? Again, it's a big kind of question of what's happening in this northern part here. Again, it's it's a very big, because the thing is, even the Russians aren't releasing a lot of things. We had that one bombing from the Russians in the 2 areas I mentioned, but besides that, we have not gotten anything. So we need to get more clear data on what's happening in this northern part. But if the Russians manage to consolidate and push the Ukrainians back and just reestablish control what they had before, that'd be good enough. But if the Ukrainians are still attacking and they're infiltrating Novi and Dnipropetrovsk, then it's very, very bad news. So we just need more data. But if the Russians are able to hold here, then it's good news. Along with this, a lot of sources are saying, the battles for Yarova and Dobropillya are still ongoing. That there's just intermixing of the troops here. Again, if the Russians were in complete control here, it would be very, very hard to supply Lyman here. Again, the road that supplies Lyman goes through Svatogorsk, Yarova, and Dobropillya, and so they really want to open up the defense line here. But the Russians are still in Yarova, they're still in Dobropillya fighting for it, but it's still being contested. The main actual logistics is across the Zaporizhia river here, and so the Russians are bombing this river heavily with lots of fabs and drones and such. And so it's very, very hard to supply Lyman with a river on your back and all that. But again, that's actually where, and also the other places the Russians are also attacking in the southern, or the Ukrainians are attacking the southern part. We had geolocations of the Ukrainians being in Yampil and and all that. But also, as we see, we have the Russians being here. Again, it's a mixed thing. It's not just that like, oh, the Ukrainians are in control of Dubrova and Orozhina. It's a mix. We could also have Russian DRGs being an active control here. So being active here. It's an intermixed of places. So the southern. That's why I'm saying the battlefield. Unlike Kostyantynivka, the battle for Lyman is still ongoing, but again, the situation in Lyman is a lot more desperate for the Ukrainians than it was 2 weeks ago. And I do think Lyman will fall, during the summer campaign. And once Lyman falls, there's no reason to hold these areas anymore, so the Ukrainians will retreat back to the other side of the Slavyansk River. And then from here, again, as I mentioned before, once Lyman is taken, you're going to continue. You're going to be able to put this Slavyansk-Izyum highway under direct fire control, and then also try to put what I call the Barnakovo-Slavyansk road under control as well. So under this one and this one too. So taking Lyman and being able to put your drone operators there, will be able to start attacking the logistics of Slavyansk. So that's what's happening there. We shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kupyansk direction. And in the Kupyansk direction, this is actually a good place for the Russians. This is another area where the Russians are actually having a very good success. And basically, this is another area where the eastern bank of the Oskol around Kupyansk is about to be destroyed for the Ukrainians. We had more and more geolocations this week showing that the Ukrainians are basically just completely getting destroyed in this area. And we had, geolocations of the Russians being in Kupyansk here, just kind of walking around in this, like, in the built-up, areas here. We had the Russians being in Polony here, this area right here. We had the Russians being in the northern part of Kupyansk, Volzhnoye. And so, last 2 weeks I talked about how the Russians took the eastern part of Kupyansk. And now they can then accumulate forces here. Along with this actually also supports their contingent that are trying to expand their foothold on the northern part of Kupyansk. Here again, Kupyansk itself, the western part, is being contested. But now that the eastern part has been cleared and is being secured, they're able to then, at least in this northern part of northwestern Kupyansk, the Russians are able to consolidate here. And now it's just the southern part where the Ukrainians are on more favorable grounds. But I do think that, but this entire eastern bank is being cleared. Right now the main area where the Ukrainians are being supplied is through Kupyansk, Volzhnoye here, and so that's why it's taking a little bit to. But once Kupyansk, Volzhnoye falls, because the Russians we had geolocation of the Russians being all over this town here, so we shall see how that. But I do think that. And then also another thing is that we had geolocations of the Russians being in Glushkovka here. We had 2 geolocations of the Russians being in this village up to the north. We had another geolocation of the Russians being in Zaragoza here, this area right here. And so it shows basically that the Russian position in the Ukrainian position here is almost over. And I do think like around the same time as around Lyman that this east bank of Kupyansk is about to be rolled up and taken. So I do think that very, very soon we're going to see this entire area be taken. The Russians will consolidate here, and then from here they could do 2 things. They could cross the river. That's another big thing that I think they might do. Another thing is they might try to reinforce the garrison in Kupyansk and try to continue expanding their bridgehead up in the north here, which is a very, again, the reason why they weren't able to consolidate in Kupyansk is because they still had this, bridgehead here. But now that they have, once they liquidate this bridgehead, they'll be able to use all these towns and villages as a supply hub to then supply their garrison in Kupyansk. And then also the secondary thing is that it's going to be towards Borova, and I do think that Borova will be, because once Lyman falls and once this east bank of Kupyansk falls, the next goal will definitely be a Borova, because then this will this Borova bridgehead kind of cuts off between the Russian positions in the Kharkov area and the Russian pushes in the Lyman area, and just taking Borova will then allow them to also start just droning all over this east bank of the eastern part of Kharkov Oblast, and so and also allow to finally secure themselves in Luhansk. Like right now, they announced they've taken Luhansk, but again, there's like this small area right here where the Ukrainians are in control, where they're able to continue doing these back and forth attacks here. So it's very much a so where they could same again what I said what they would do in Kostyantynivka, for example, where they did the same thing in Toretsk, actually, if you guys remember, where they continued infiltrating the northern part of Toretsk to not deny that the Russians have taken it, for example. But they'll do the same. They're doing the same thing in Luhansk, and so taking Borova will not only take more part of Kharkov, which is a Russian oblast, but also allow them to take Luhansk. And also, then there'll be a complete, they'll be able to use the Oskol as a natural barrier to protect themselves, and not only that, this will simplify, straighten the front line and allow the Russians to continue assaulting this east bank of Kharkov, and also support the Lyman garrison here. Alrighty. And also in the Kupyansk area, we had a geolocation that came out showing that the Russians are back in Rekadivka here. And so that does show that the Russians are, kind of still, we had geolocation a couple, like, earlier this year about them being in Kondrastovka. So if the Russians could then maybe continue pushing, maybe try to secure themselves in Morova, that would also be good. So just just consolidating themselves, kind of on, just continue expanding the bridgehead, continue clearing out basements, continue pushing soldiers in here. And then now, again, unlike before, where there was basically barely any logistics to the northern part of Kupyansk to support them. Now that the Russians are clearing out this east bank of the Oskol, they're able to, actually directly supply their garrison here. So it's going to be a lot easier to supply them here, and it's going to be a lot harder for the Ukrainians to kick them out. But it's still a bit hard, so we shall see. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kharkov direction, and this kind of area right here, where there's been a lot of interesting updates. In this area, we had a lot of sources are saying that the Russians are battling for the town of Petro-Ivanovka and Nova Vasilivka here, I think. Yeah, Nova Vasilivka. And so we haven't had any geolocations yet. The main Ukrainian defense is around the town of Kolodovsky here, Zasavna here. And so, but, again, what the Russians are doing here, again, they're, just clearing, taking these cities here. They're going to then use these cities to then take Kolodovsky directly. And what the Russians are doing here is then trying to take this kind of second Ukrainian defense. The Ukrainians had defenses along the border town, and then but it was just a bunch of small little villages. They were barely able to defend them. There was no really use to defending them. But this area right here is a line of villages. They have supplies towards big logistics hubs like Villa Baruch and so forth. And so, this is actually a good defense line that the Ukrainians could hold. And so they've been using this as a defense line for a while. And then, again, the Russians trying to push along the border here are exposing themselves to drones, and so it's very hard to do that. But now the Russians could then use kind of, if they could take, infiltrate these villages right here, consolidate here, and then continue pushing, they could then, battle for Kolodovsky here, and then move north towards Nova Zhernuvka and so forth. And then, from here, the Russians could then take this line of defense and then have a more solid, more forward operating base to continue pushing. So as you can see, this is just continuous, and not only will taking this allow the Russians more breathing room in terms of using this road to supply Dorishnia, which is the main logistics hub towards Kupyansk, but it also helps them continue squeezing out the Ukrainians in this northwestern Kharkov direction. Along with this, the Russians are continuously attacking the border villages along this area. The Russians in the last 2 weeks have completely taken the town of Oromivka here, this village right here. Along with this, the Russians are now pushing along, expanding their bridgehead here a little bit, taking more of these like tree lines that are, to the south of these areas, probably just giving some breathing space, and so forth. I do think that the main thing that the Russians will be doing in my computer has decided to shit itself is, for some reason, I think it's always in the Kharkov direction that my computer decides to shit itself. I don't know why, but maybe if I pause for a second here. We'll come back. But anyway, yeah, I'll just wait for a second. But anyway, we're in where I need to talk about. But anyway, so this area that you're looking at right now, Malovolchka, Vorinovka, I do think the Russians will continue putting the squeeze here. We actually had another geolocation down here in the town of Rizanovko of a Russian DRG activity activating here. And so actually that puts a big question. You know, a lot of sources are saying, well, what, you know, there was just one geolocation, maybe it was just a DRG, who knows? But the fact the Russians are, you know, right here shows that, you know, maybe this area is a lot more lucid, you know, fluid than we thought. Now, it's a lot harder to infiltrate here and supply here, so, you know, but also, same thing with the Ukrainians. A lot of these villages here, I'm betting, like, you know, I don't think there's actually a strong Ukrainian presence here, for example. You know, they're under, like, you know, in, like, very important logistics nodes, like in Perinovko, Bilokolodasky, Villanurivka, but this kind of northern sector here, the only reason they're here is probably to supply, you know, to help support the Ukrainians that are here, where there's a bunch of more built-up villages along the river. But I think that, you know, now that the Russians are kind of pushing along all along this area, the reason for this is that once the Russians take this entire area from Volchansk to Berdovki here will serve as like a forward operating base where the Russians could put their drone operators, their infantry groups, and then start striking, you know, Ukraine positions in Bilokolodasky, Perlanovko, Vernivka. The thing is, I don't think they're going to continue pushing southwards. You know, I do think they're going to continue pushing down along the river here because there's a forest, but there's just barely any, you know, villages or anything to protect yourself from drones. So, you know, Ukrainian drone operators in Bilokolodasky or, you know, or this town right here could easily attack Russian soldiers here. So I do think what the Russians will do is continue focusing on the western part here, but also in this eastern part. So I do think that, you know, they'll continue pushing this way, you know, take this area, and then just continue pushing towards Perlanovka here. And then from here, you know, maybe they could then, you know, take something like this. Right, so, or, you know, even something like this even. So, and that way, you know, then that, you know, from here you can see that, you know, there's a, you know, because the thing is that this is almost like a big extended pimple for the Ukrainians in the Kharkov area. So very interesting to see what happens there. Alrighty. And then also, but the thing is about this area is that the Ukrainians are actually on the counterattack here and are actually, now the thing is, I haven't actually seen this, right? So this is a lot of areas where, you know, where, how do you say it? This is more like Ukrainian hearsay. I don't know if this is like, they updated it based on deep state map or, I haven't personally seen like a geolocation. You know, I try to get like a balance of sources, for example, but there is some like kind of quacklings that the Ukrainians have done some sort of counterattack and are like now, you know, have retaken Verla-Perizivka and are battling for Vilcha and Semyonivka and Harasovka. But Russian sources are saying you know, the Russians are still here, that the Russians are now, you know, infiltrating Ukrainska, Sonolska Bir. It's probably just a bunch of DRGs, because the thing is, you know, it's very easy probably to infiltrate this area. Again, also the Ukrainians have this giant forest, which the Ukrainians use to, you know, to attack here. So I do think that actually you know, a lot of these lines are all connected, you know, so it's like, you know, as the Russians push southwards, the thing is they might also have to take this this giant forest, and so to do that, the Russians might have to, you know, maybe take Ternovo, you know, so it's a big thing to see what would happen here. So, but again, it's all, you know, this entire push here is a very, you know, the Russians really want to take this area right here because this would very simply help their logistics and such, and also just take a bigger part of the Kharkov region. Speaking of Kharkov, the Russians are also actually opened up another front here, and we talked about how last week the Russians, you know, took the town of Granovka and such, but this week we actually the Russians are now battling for the town of Kazachalopa. And you know, we actually had geolocation of the Russians being in the northern residential area of Kazachalopa, and they were bombing the Ukrainians that are in the central part of Kazachalopa. So, you know, the Russians are slowly infiltrating here. Kazachalopa is a very big town. I think it has a population of a couple thousand, and so the Russians really want to use this as a natural, you know, place where they could, you know, take it. This will give them another hub where they can consolidate troops, just have, you know, continue building that border defenses. So, you know, I do think that I do think they're going to try to take Kazachalopa, but once they take it, I think they're going to stop here. You know, maybe they'll have their, you know, front line be something like this. You know, who knows? Maybe they'll activate somewhere in this area too. You don't know. You know, a lot of this. I think the purpose of the northern group is not necessarily to like, push towards Kharkov, but to like basically pin down Ukrainian forces, try to like drag them to Sumy, drag them to to Kharkov and all that. So we shall see how that goes. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Sumy direction, and in the Sumy direction, there's been a lot of more interesting. The Russians are continuously holding the Razny Pokrovka line here, but there's been no real big changes. Some sources are saying the Russians are slowly but surely moving towards the town of Maisky, this area right here. So they're like kind of slowly trying to take these some of these tree lines around Razny. But besides that, the Russians are just kind of holding their line in this area, which makes sense. I thought that maybe they're going to try to push towards Krasnopilya here. But if they don't do that, then this is basically just to try to expand their border control here. Now, what's most interesting, however, is that they're actually doing a very big. There's actually been some very big news happening in the northern part of Sumy. We talked about before how the Russians took Malokotrovka and Kotrovka, but what's actually expanded is that the Russians are actually slowly but surely infiltrating all these villages that are and towns that are along what they call the second line of defenses for Sumy. The first line of defense was in Yunakovka and around this area, but the Russians have now taken up this area, and now the Russians are actually slowly but surely expanding into this area. And we actually had a lot of maps are saying the Russians are battling for Ivzolonivsky in Novosich in Pyrskyivka here. And so we actually don't have much geolocations coming from this area, so it's hard to know what's what and everything. But it does show that the Russians are battling for the second line of defense. And again, the main purpose here is to basically take all these villages here, and then the grand prize will be the town of Khotyn, the Khotyn defense line. And so the Russians could then, if they could have something like this, then this is a line of villages that they could use to accumulate forces. They could hide in the forests here, and from here they could use it to start striking the logistics, using drones to strike the northern part of Sumy and all that. So it'll be very, very bad news for the Ukrainians if the Russians continue pushing there. So very good news for the Russians in Sumy. Also, there's been back and forth to the town of Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia here. The Russians claim they have captured both of them, but we actually had geolocation of the Ukrainians doing a counterattack and re-entering the central part of Dnipropetrovsk. So we still need a little bit more to know, are they fully consolidated in these two villages? If so, what will happen next? There's a river that kind of divides these two areas. And so, maybe what they do, the Russians will maybe try to push through these forests towards Mala Rubinishka here. Who knows? Again, it's a big question of what's next. Are these areas just distraction operations? Are they actually serious? I do think they're probably more like distraction operations. I don't think they've actually allocated a lot of resources for this. So all they can do is if this was a real push, if they actually wanted to make this a real battlefield, they would have maybe made the main effort to be towards Krasnopilya, for example, and then try to take kind of more of this eastern part of Sumy, because then that just makes them a step further towards encircling Sumy. Anyway, so yeah, that's the Sumy direction. All right, now we're gonna go to the we kind of bypassed everything, but we're actually gonna go to the Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk area, because this is another area. This is actually kind of more where the Ukrainians have a bit of an interesting thing happening. This used to be one of the best areas for the Russians in the Zaporizhia direction, but now it's kind of slowing down. And because there's actually not much to report in terms of Russian success here in these last 2 weeks. A lot for Ukraine. Now, the biggest news is that the Ukrainians have reactivated the South Donetsk sector, and they're now infiltrating this area. So the biggest thing is that this again we talked about the South Donetsk area, and the thing about this is that it's divided by a river here. So this area kind of between the Vochka River and I forgot what this river is. I think this is what river is this? The Molkyar River. This area right here is now turning into a gray zone, and the thing is that it's we had, for example, a geolocation of the Ukrainians entering Poduvnia, but then we had the Russians posted a video a couple days later showing themselves in Poduvnia, and I think also in Tolstoya. My computer is deciding to shit itself again. But anyway, that does show that. And then, for example, the same thing happened a bit more to the south here, towards the town of Vosa-Rentka here. We had the Ukrainians here, and then a few days later, the Russians posted a video showing them there. The thing is, I don't think this. I think this is a lot of this is a new Ukraine tactic where they're trying to do a bit of a media thing where they're trying to say, look how the Russia's losing. Look, we're because the thing is, besides the battleground, there's been this giant Ukrainian operation to strike Russian logistics into Crimea and such, and so they've been a bit more effective in doing that. And they're trying to make a big, and they're trying to show like in these maps, like, oh, look how small Russian gains are compared to before, or even like, oh, the Ukrainians are getting more ground. The thing is that because of this war, is that it's very hard to you actually could basically make a very good propaganda, because the thing is that people are the lines are the front line is intermixed. Some units are in one village, some the other side is in another village. Some are there, but like they're in opposite sides. So like for example, there might be still Russian force, DRGs active in Andriyka Klasova, but there might be Ukrainian DRGs trying to be active in Pudunia, for example. Same thing in Zelona High, and then maybe in Zelona High they're intermixed. And so it's just like, but the thing is, if you're say a Ukrainian or Russian propaganda, if you want to put a good spin on it, you ignore that there's maybe a Ukrainian or Russian DRGs active here, and then you claim that your DRGs are a thing of solid control. So for example, if you're Ukrainian, you might say like you might ignore that there's probably still a Russian presence in Zelona High and all along on the other side of the Volchka River, and just say, oh well, maybe the Russians are only in this area, and so you ignore that, but then you say, oh, but there's Ukrainians here, so that means that the Ukrainians are now in control here. So you make a beautiful report that says you've recaptured this area. But then if you're a Russian, you might say like, oh, you ignore that there's Ukrainian troops in Ukrainian DRGs, and then just say like, oh, we still have Russian troops in these villages, so actually we're still in control here. So again, it's very easy to claim which side is which, and by just using DRGs, because then you could just send a few troops in, and then even though they die, you could show evidence of them being there, saying that the front line is a gray zone. So now the main reason the Ukrainians attacked here, again, is to put more pressure on the Dnipropetrovsk front. We actually had more and more geolocations of the Russians being in Verbova, but then we had a geolocation of the Ukrainians being actually very further south around Solotki and such. So again, this Dnipropetrovsk area is probably one of the most biggest clusterfucks I've ever seen. Again, it's very much like a big intermixed area. For some reason, I feel like I've been here before. Like I just had extreme fucking deja vu. Holy shit. Anyway, so there's this giant, just like a gray zone here, and it's just like some area. It seems like what the CREC is showing is that kind of in Berezov, kind of this like orange areas are kind of mostly under Russian control, but there's probably still Ukrainian presence here. Yellow is probably under mostly Ukrainian control, but there's also Russian positions here that they can infiltrate. So it's a big question of like what's what, what's which. And it's still the Russians have still not been able to like reassert control here, and at least along this area, and it seems like also the Russians haven't put any troops here to help solidify their gains here. So it's a big question of what's happening. So, also because of this, the Ukrainians have retaken control of basically Ivanovka and Novopavlovka. So now it's just, and so this kind of bridgehead on the other side of the Volchka River and Novopavlovka and Ivanovka, probably that's the biggest gain for the Ukrainians. I haven't actually seen any geolocation. This is mostly just map updates, but according to mappers, is that that's probably gonna be the biggest gain for the Ukrainians. Is that because if they could kick the Russians out of Ivanovka and Novopavlovka, then that basically very very much prevents them from creating a bridgehead here, which they were doing, and puts a big damper on things. But again, this area right here is a huge, big back and forth. Also, more in the actually Zaporizhia area. We talked about the Russians took Volozhenka, Verka Terasy, and Girivka, but this week we haven't had any more geolocations and so forth. Ukrainians are saying for example, Ukrainian sources are saying they've retaken Ternovata, for example. I haven't actually seen any geolocation of that again. But again, the thing is, maybe I don't have the source for that. I'm not saying I have all the evidence. Maybe someone has evidence. I just don't see it. I need more, Telegram channels to see. But neutral and pro-Ukrainian sources saying that Ternovata and this area right here has been recaptured by the Ukrainians, which again would be very bad news for the Russians. And so Also, they're saying that the Ukrainians are doing infiltration tactics where they're like infiltrating this areas right here, and in Gurivka and all that. So it's just so for example, that's why they're saying Gurivka was retaken, for example. But so it does show like this entire Zaporizhia area is very much there's not collapsing or anything, but it's like the Ukrainians have done their goal of stopping the Russian offensive here, and it's now just the Russians are trying to hold on for dear life here. Not for dear life, but it's like very hard for them to hold on here. So we shall see. The main goal for the Ukrainians here is to liquidate the Gansha River bridgehead, which the Russians were developing. So if they could take the Russians out of Verkhotursk and Vozhedemka, that would be good news for them. If they could continue pushing and consolidating, and again, the main goal here is probably to try to retake Dobropillya. That'll be the biggest goal here. But right now they're just trying to destroy the Russian bridge on the Gansha River, and they're attacking the flanks here to draw off Russian reserves here. And then a bit more to this area, the Ukrainian counteroffensive that was also successful here. It has been stopped. Right now the Russians are holding on to the southern part of Stephanhersk and Plavny and the southern part of Primorska, but we had another geolocation of the Ukrainians being bombed in the central part of Primorska, so it does show that they did kick the Russians out. And so the Russians have stabilized here, but again, the Ukrainians are probably still going to counterattacking here. They probably really want to take back Stephanhersk fully. To do that, they actually have to take this again. I talked about this last time. They have to take back the central, this high-rise building area, which is where the central Russian resistance is. Anyway, and then also we had some, a geolocation that just came out showing that the Russians are in southern Novodilinivka here. So it probably does show that maybe the Russians are a bit more closer to Oreka from the south than we once thought. And I'm going to wait a second as my computer decides to stop shitting itself. I am getting actually a new computer soon, so that hopefully once I get it later this summer, it's actually a custom built one, so I'm just building it, getting it. So hopefully very soon, maybe even as soon as the next time I upload, maybe in a week or two, I might have it. But but very soon for sure. This computer is like on its last legs. But anyway, that's the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk direction. And then the last thing we're going to talk about, because actually barely anything happened there this week, I just want to slightly talk about it, just to update you guys, is the Dobropillya direction. Let's go there as my computer decides to shit itself. There's nothing much to talk about here. The Russians are, consolidating around Grishny. They took Nova Alexandria, Vasilivka, and then just expanding themselves around the tree lines around it. There's infiltrations of Beliska, but there's also Ukrainian infiltrations of the mines to the west of Rodinsky, for example. The Russians are slowly but surely trying to expand into Novopyrodovna. Russians are saying they took it, but we shall see if they're able to actually hold it. But I'm betting that the Ukrainians could probably do DRG activity into Novopyrodovna if they want. So yeah, it's Russian sources are also saying that they've are taking Vilnius, Stepy, and Nova Donbass, but there's probably just kind of more DRG activity happening here as well. But yeah, but there's not been that much changes in the Dobropillya direction. Alrighty, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed my weekly Russian-Ukrainian update. I'll be back soon in like a week or two again, and I'll let you guys know what happens. Alrighty, so be sure to subscribe to my channel, give these videos a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this around. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.